Welcome to Equals Assessment Administration and Scoring Training with new electronic scoring. I'm Karen Ross Brown from AbleNet. Our agenda for today includes equals content in general and as it relates to the assessment. Assessment purposes, materials required to administer the assessment, prep and organization of the materials, assessment features, scoring, and placing and grouping students. There are 4 parts to the equals kit: equals content kit, equals manipulative kit, equals technology lesson center, and equals members only content. Equals content kit includes teacher's guides, work mats, posters, and student tools. In addition, there are 2 smaller boxes included in the equals content kit, one containing all of the cards and the other containing the equals assessment. The equals assessment requires use of some of the manipulatives from the equals manipulative kit. However, the Equals Technology Lesson Center is not used in the assessment in any way. Equals members-only digital content contains resources, scoring materials, and other items used in the assessment. Members-only digital content is typically found in an orange USB drive placed in your Equals Content Kit box, or you may keep it on your desktop or laptop or is found on your district server. If you have not downloaded the updated version, you will want to do so, as electronic scoring has been recreated, allowing you to easily compare scores between students to group them and view assessment scores in several different contexts. Look to your screen at the bottom for the link to locate equals members only content and additional members only content. Equals is a multisensory math program which has been aligned to state standards, core content connectors, Common Core standards, and Common Core essential elements. It is based on a foundation of essential concepts and skills that students build upon to develop useful and functional math knowledge and understanding. What I mean by a foundation of essential concepts and skills is the set of concepts and skills recognized by general education as foundational math, typically pre-readiness through about 4th grade. Functional math knowledge refers to using learned math concepts to solve a problem. It's why we all learn math. It's the purpose of math, to solve problems. There are 6 math content areas in equals. The first 5 in orange are from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics: numbers and operations, algebra, geometry, measurement, and data analysis and probability. Attending and exploring is the next content area, the 6th one, that was added by AbleNet. We included attending and exploring for those students who need a very specific place to begin because they either have no experience with math or no defined set of math skills. With attending and exploring lessons, students are taught how to attend to math lessons, touch or tolerate touch of math manipulatives, and then slowly begin to build understanding of math in the context of what they know about their world. These are the first 9 lessons in equals, and they make up the 9 items in the attending and exploring screening tool as part of the assessment process, which is to assess the student's pre-readiness skills and answer the question, do I start my student in chapter 1, or is it necessary to assess my student in all 5 remaining subtests? It is important to know about the connections within and between the content areas shown here. The lessons in equals from all of these content areas are arranged so that one set of skills and concepts supports the next set or subsequent sets of skills and concepts. Here is an example using the math concept parts and whole. I know I will find many examples of that in numbers and operations. I picked this one. It is an equation representing the addition of parts 3 and 1, which results in the whole amount of 4. I can represent that idea with an equation, sets of objects. I can draw X's on a piece of paper and so on. In algebra, I use the concept of parts and whole to solve an unknown. And of course, it relies on that idea that I learned in numbers and operations. Now I'm applying it in algebra. Think about geometry. We talk about parts of a shape. I know parts of a shape are important in identifying like and unlike properties of shapes. I can think of parts as sides, angles, number of sides, and the whole shape created with those parts. In measurement, we think of a ruler as a 1 foot length. That's the whole. We think of the inches as parts of the whole 1 foot ruler. Without those parts, we wouldn't be able to measure anything that's less or more than a foot. I know in data, when I create a graph, I take each part of information that I've gathered and I put it together in a display so I can make sense of and compare that data. The parts help me create the whole graph that I can now use as organized information. Recognizing and using these connections promotes generalization of concepts and reinforces the importance of the system of numbers, a connecting link through all of math. This built-in structure in and of itself is a support for students as it never changes. It's ordered and logical and is used and applied throughout all content. This is the reason it is so important for students to learn math in this way, building skills over time and learning the system of numbers and its many, many applications to all content areas. To recap, all content areas are taught in order, from easiest to hardest, and mixed together from Chapter 1 through Chapter 10, representing a sequence of prerequisite skills and concepts that students learn and connect to the next lesson and subsequent lessons, learning over time, which is how we all learn. It utilizes the connections within and between content areas. Relating this to the assessment, things look a bit different. We took benchmarks from the lessons and placed them in lesson order, then sorted them by content areas, about 20 benchmarks per chapter. By doing that, we essentially used the content areas as subtests. We did that in the assessment so we could get more information about what the student knows, where the gaps are, what content areas the student has learned, or perhaps has never been taught. The purpose of the Equals assessment is to identify the student's math knowledge, their strengths, gaps in understanding, and any splinter skills. You'll want to place students where they can begin successfully in a group with other students with similar math knowledge. We know placement will not be a perfect fit. Student scores will differ from each other, so grouping students is a bit of a compromise. We will learn, however, there are advantages to learning in a group and positive outcomes from being placed in a lesson, the math concept the student might already know, but perhaps doesn't know how to solve a problem with that knowledge. Knowing that makes the decision a bit easier. Students gain math knowledge from many aspects of math: concepts, problem solving, thinking, making decisions, and communicating what they know and learn. Finally, by way of the assessment, we can identify any adaptations or accommodations that were successful for students when showing or telling what they know during the assessment. This will be useful during lessons as students can continue to use those successful adaptations and accommodations as they learn. The Equals assessment is a useful tool to place students within the Equals curriculum, but it is also a great informational piece that can show your students current math knowledge overall. As a reminder, the Equals assessment is stored in the box labeled Equals assessment. The assessment includes 2 assessment manuals. Part 1 contains attending and exploring screening tool and 4 subtests: algebra, data, geometry, and measurement. Part 2 contains the entire numbers and operations subtest. The largest subtest is, of course, numbers and operations, which means the largest content area of Equals lessons is also numbers and operations. The subtests are tabbed along the bottom of the flipbook to easily locate each. Each of the assessment flipbooks have the same introduction. Before beginning the assessment process, it is important to review the assessment introduction that is found in either assessment manual. The introduction provides information on the assessment process, 3 types of test items, other student supports, scoring, aligning scores with a suggested start point for instruction if you plan on scoring the assessment manually. There is also, as I mentioned earlier, an electronic scoring option, and we'll look at both of those today. So let's take a look now at prepping assessment material. In the equals assessment box I referred to earlier, you will find 6 work mats, not only labeled with the number, but also assessment. There are copies of these in your content kit, but we duplicated and labeled them assessment so they could remain in this box, folded. There are 2 student tools, rulers to cut apart and trim, and a box template to assemble for volume. 2 pages of the assessment pick symbols are in the box as well, and the 2 flip books I mentioned earlier. There are copies of the assessment pick symbols in PDF format in the equals assessment folder, if any are damaged or lost. All of these materials are specific to the assessment and should remain in the assessment box to promote efficiency and organization when administering the assessment. This is a quick view of the assessment materials included and required to administer the assessment. 2 flip books, student tools, lesson pick symbols, and work mats. The student response booklet, found in the assessment folder in members only, includes the protocol and student response pages. You will need 1 per student. If you're using electronic scoring, you will not need the protocol if you have access to a computer as you are assessing your students. If you don't have access, use the paper protocol and transfer the scores from the assessment items given to the electronic scoring protocol. Manipulative kit items are used repeatedly throughout the assessment for efficiency and consistency. There's also a list of equals assessment materials, as you see on the left, to the left of the manipulatives. And there's a list of classroom materials on that particular list as well that you will need in most of the subtests. To prepare for the assessment, take the time to cut out and sort the included pick symbols and the rulers and the paper box. I wouldn't assemble the paper box, just leave it flat. You might not get that far in the assessment with your students, so better just to wait and see if you will need that. Review the work mat so you know what you have. The assessment pick symbols are generally used as additional response choices as indicated in the flip book. When you cut those apart, you can organize those. Print the student response booklet from members only, 1 for each student. If students are able to use dry erase markers, you can laminate the set of the 13 student response pages. Those first 3 pages make up the student protocol, so you'll want to keep those as paper. Another option, if you do laminate the student response pages, you could place sticky notes on the page for the student to write on, and then you can take a picture of it if you want to keep a record of it, pull off the sticky note and put a new one on for the next student. That's another possibility. You want to, if you have a student who has a communication device, you might want to scan for verbal responses in the assessment items. Guess about the amount of assessment items you think your student will be able to answer correctly, just to get an idea, and then just check through those assessment items and see what kind of language is being used. So if a student has a communication device, you might want to keep a list of possible choices that you're looking at for this. So it would be answer choices for the student to be able to answer your question. If it's a possibility for your speech and language clinician to be a part of that process, these images could be downloaded into the computer on an assessment page. If that's not possible or that doesn't pertain to your students at all, then just skip right over that piece. But some possibilities would include the number list up to 10, the words yes, no, the colors, shapes, and so on. But there are optional varied ways for students to show what they know, even if they do not have a device or enough message locations on a device to respond with verbal language. There are a lot of options there. This is just one of them. I had mentioned, I believe, images before. If I haven't, I'm going to in a little bit. Those images are found in members-only digital content. So we'll talk about that again in a minute if I've already mentioned it. Print the assessment materials list that is found in the equals assessment folder, then gather the classroom material. Remember to store those items in the box or a bag so they're ready to use. Assess in your math instruction area if it's possible, so you can have access to your equals manipulative kit and grab what you need as you go from one assessment item to the next. However, if you have to, gather required materials for one subtest at a time and take them to that other location. So for example, and you don't need to do these in order, for example, take the geometry assessment, that the part one of Flipbook. Look at the materials list for that particular subtest. So looking at geometry, see what you need, gather those materials, and then assess one student after the other. So that's how you can use the list. Then put those away, get the next set of materials for the next subtest, and repeat. So in that way, you're only gathering what you need for that subtest one at a time. And that's going to save you time. It'll also give your students a bit of a break in between testing sessions. So, consider that as an option, no matter where you're assessing your students. View the action dictionary from members only if there's a need to support students' language, motor, and or vision during the assessment, and then prep those needed adaptations, whatever those might be. To locate all of these things in members only, let's take a look. As I mentioned earlier, there are two kinds of equals members only digital content. There's the original equals members only digital content. That's what you're replacing on that USB drive if you have that, or if you have it on your desktop. Then there's a second one, additional members only digital content that has some new items on it, including JPEG images that I was just talking about a minute ago. So when you open up equals members only digital content, there are 5 folders, and 2 of those folders are shown here, equals assessment and equals resources. And within that equals assessment folder, there are 3 more folders. One is called equals assessment again. Then there's informal assessment, right, for collecting data. And then there's lesson text. There's one page, 2 page, I guess, lesson test per lesson, right, for your students. The other folder is equals resources. That's where you find the action dictionary, and you find a set of vocabulary images and action images. But in additional members only content, you'll find even more. So those would refer to problems that are within the equals lessons. So these images work out really well in the lessons. There is a set of equals tools. And then there are actually the card images of vocabulary and action. So just as a recap, to get ready, here's a list of things for you to do. Go to members only, download that new version if you don't have it yet. You'll end up with 2 folders. In that first folder, equals members only digital content, you'll find the folders equal assessment and equals resources. Notice that everything in purple here is what you'll find in that equals assessment folder. In the equals resources folder, you'll find the action dictionary. Both of those are in orange here. So the equals assessment folder has most of the materials that you need. So that would be the student response booklet that includes the protocol, the assessment materials list that we're about to look at here in a little bit. And then you'll want to, so that's what you want to print, but what you want to save would be electronic scoring, because that's an Excel spreadsheet. And it's set up for you to score. So that's ready to go. And then there's the Action Dictionary, which is a PDF file. And you can print that if you want, but there are embedded videos, not on every page, but there are embedded videos. And those are in the PDF itself. So if it doesn't matter to you whether there's videos or not, you can just print it and do whatever you like with it. Number 2, use assessment materials list to gather classroom materials. And I'm about to show you this in a minute. Anything you need from the equals content kit, which is pretty rare. And this is not in every subtest. And equal assessment pick symbol that came with the kit, or perhaps you needed to print a new version of those if you didn't have them in that equals assessment folder again. So if you need those, that's where they'll be. Otherwise, you can just sort them by category, whatever works for you, where you know where to get what you need in the moment. And then finally, you will assess in the math instruction area or another area if you have to access the manipulative. So gather the manipulative kit materials if you have to go in another area for one subtest, and then assess all students. Then just repeat with the remaining subtests. Put those away, get the next batch kind of a thing. Choose a student, if you can, who requires the least amount of adaptations and is the most flexible, as that gives you a chance to practice the assessment in a little bit more with ease. So that's a suggestion, just to feel it out. But it is also a good idea to practice on your own with nobody, or with your own children, or with a colleague. The first 3 items in each subtest, you can get a feel of what it's like. And we will walk through an example today, but doing it yourself somehow just builds that confidence, and you feel like, okay, I got this. It won't take long, and you will feel real confident about giving this assessment. So in the equals assessment folder that I just mentioned, you'll find the materials list. This is what it looks like. There are essentially just 2 pages. This includes all of the subtests. So each section you see here is a subtest. So let's take a look at attending and exploring. So this attending and exploring, again, is not technically a subtest, but you will need materials for that, and you can see what you'll need. Here it says on the left what you need for the manipulative kit. You won't need anything from the content kit. You have some items from classroom materials that you need to get, and you will not need any assessment pick symbols. Okay, so your biggest list is probably the classroom materials list, and we tried very hard to identify materials that will work with the assessment that most, if not all, teachers would have in their classrooms. The reason why that is, and visually you can see it has more for you to get than any of the subtests. It's because those early lessons help students connect math to what they know about their world. So that would be connecting algebra and patterns with their daily schedule, because they already know that. It's a good example of that. And also to songs and books, and that's why you're going to see those listed here. That's not typical. That's the way it is in those early lessons, because we all learn by anchoring our knowledge to something we already know. When we think about students who are at the very, very beginning of math, what they know about is what their experiences are in every day in school and every day at home. So that's why there's a bit more there. When you take a look at that list, you can see you probably more than likely have those things in the classroom. Here in algebra, there isn't a ton of items here, or in data, or in measurement. There's just not a lot to do there. In geometry, there are 0 classroom materials. And in numbers and operations, when I combine that with the other subtests that I just showed you, this is basically what you're going to need. And attending and exploring is different from this, but the rest is essentially things like a calendar, student schedule, sticky notes, paper markers, dry erase markers, scissors, pencils, masking tape, paper clips, rubber bands. That's what we tried to stick to, because we knew those were the most common items you would find in a classroom. There is something that's a little bit different in numbers and operations. The only subtest that requires something from the content kit. So that would be numeral cards. So that's in the card set. So the numeral cards would be in the content card set. I'm sure you've come across that when you were organizing the cards. So it's numerals 1 through 20, and that's optional, so you don't really need to have that. If you'd rather just write 1 through 20 on a set of index cards, you can do it. Maybe you already have that. You could do that too. Place value cards, also from that content card list. Those are 10 and 100 frame cards. And then also a blank 10 frame, which is a student tool. And you'll find that in your content box, along with some other student tools in the work mats in that area. But you would only need those items if you get past item 58. So it's not something that's automatic for everybody. Not every student gets that far in the assessment. So I want to wait until and see if you get that far before you gather extra things. Classroom materials are here. I already mentioned those. And the pick symbols, I didn't talk about those, but in a few of the subtests, the specific pick symbols show up there. So that lets you know ahead of time where those are used. This is that paper student response booklet, the protocol, but there's an electronic one as well that I will show you. They're organized by 5 subtests. So that would be algebra, data analysis, geometry, measurement, numbers, and operations. That attending and exploring piece is separate, and we're going to get to that too. The front page is for, I've got it here, there it is. The front page is for observations during the assessment and for student information. So you can see how this looks, right? We'll take a closer look at this in a moment. But you can see how it's lined up with each subtest is separated with a little blank space, and it's renumbered. So every subtest begins with item 1. The amount in each subtest will vary. So when you're looking at the student response booklet protocol, and this is something you might have to use when you want to use electronic scoring if you don't have access to a computer in your assessment area where you're assessing your student. The subtests are titled in gray boxes. So up here is algebra in this gray box, and so on. You can see it looks a little bit tiny from here, but each of these are separated. There's an assessment item number first, and then there's a blank line, and you're going to enter. Okay, that's the header, but on the blank line, you're going to enter a 1 or a 0. So 1 if you got it, 0 if you didn't get it. It's pretty simple. In the column to the right of each item is an A. A stands for adaptation. If you give the adaptation version, and we will walk through that today, if you give the adaptation version, you will check that box, and we'll get to why we're checking the box for that and what that looks like in a little bit. On the left, I just brought up the electronic protocol. So this is with the Excel spreadsheet. That's what this is what this came from that. You can see that the subtest is listed on the side and it's color coded. Algebra is always purple. You have the item numbers next to it. And then here's a bonus. You get to see which lesson and lesson objective we pulled that assessment item from, right? These are the benchmarks that we pulled from the equals lessons and became an assessment item. That's good information to know. We'll talk a little bit about that later. When you look at this, here we have adaptation, right? Instead of a column with the letter A, we have an adaptation column. Oh, I'm showing the score. This one backwards here a little bit for me. On the left, it says subtest. Okay, we talked about that. On the right is where you score 1 or 0. The adaptation item is marked with an X. Now, this is the important piece. The adaptation item is the only item of the 3 assessment item types. Every time you give a new assessment item to the student, there are 3 types, and those types are based on the kind of support students need. I will walk you through those so you'll know what I'm talking about. Adaptation is the most support, and when I give an adaptation version of the assessment item, then that will affect the score. So that X will automatically be configured in the electronic scoring. I will also show you how to do that manually. Then there's a column for the accommodation version. So we have a typical version, accommodation version, adaptation version. Giving the adaptation version is going to affect how the assessment is scored. Giving an accommodation version is not going to affect the score, but it's for your information. What did I give to my student? What kind of support did my student need, right? And there's a space for comments too, so you'll be able to type that in. Okay, so that's kind of compare and contrast. But for every student, the rest of the student response book looks like this, right? So the student will take a marker and extend a pattern. Or it might be student extending a pattern with 2 cubes. That's another way that could be done. But when you're making tally marks, you really either make tally marks with a marker, or you could be placing a straw or a set of straws, right, for a tally mark as well. When you're writing, you could write 10 for this stack of 10 Unifix cubes. You could also use a rubber stamp, right? You could do the same with, right, I'm going to write down how many I have. I have 1 rod of 10 or stack of 10 and 7 more, and that's 17, right? So it is the place where students need to write because that's what we're measuring in that particular assessment item. So let's take a look at these versions. So the assessment manuals are spiral bound and the pages are set up head to head. So the teacher sits across from the student. You'll be facing your student. The student view here, as I'm looking at it this way, I can see the student is facing this page on the left and you're facing this page on the right. The item and subtest number are listed at the bottom of each page. This example, the one I'm about to show you, is from the subtest algebra, and it's item number 5. So we can see that right at the bottom, algebra, item number 5. You can match that up with the protocol, pretty easy. So I was just talking about typical accommodation adaptation items. So you'll see this, I'm going to explain it here, and then you'll see an example of it. So then you'll get the full view of it. So this is the typical version. The very first one is always typical. These are always in the same order. Typical version means the student needs nothing more than the assessment. There's no other adaptation I would be giving my student for a typical version. I am measuring full understanding of the math concept, the full thing. But I'm not providing anything extra for that student. I'm not providing any kind of accommodation or anything. If a student can tell me the answer verbally or completely independently, right, with a communication device, and the student can move things around on the table, that's the student who would use the typical version. The accommodation version, however, is pretty much the same thing with a difference. So I'm still measuring with full understanding. And the 1 that I get for a correct item in typical is also a 1 in the accommodation version, right? Both of those are going to score 1 if I got it right, 0 if I didn't get it right. So it's full understanding of the math concept. However, the student needs communication and or physical supports, whatever that takes for that student. They're built in, but there's other options as well. The third version is the adaptation version, and this is the student's opportunity to show what they know. We want to give every support we can to that student so that we really get to know what the student knows. And that was always a struggle as a teacher for me, is how do I know what my students know? A lot of my students didn't talk out loud. They were beginning communicators. I really didn't have an idea. What I like about this assessment is if the student can show me something, if a student can show me partial knowledge, I will see that reflected in the assessment. So I said earlier that when I marked X that I gave that adaptation version, that changed the score. It does. It cuts the score in half because the student is showing me something that he or she knows, a partial knowledge. But that's beneficial to the student because before it was 1 or 0. Either you got it or you don't. And that didn't give me any information because oftentimes my students would have zeros. And even if they learned a bit of that, if they had some knowledge of that, it wouldn't show up. But in this assessment, it will. And that's the exciting part of it. So the criteria is going to be different, right? The typical and accommodation criteria are going to be the same. The criteria for the adaptation version is less, right? It's less. It's because we're only seeing the student know something about that. And the student could very well show the full understanding of that, and that's great. They can also show partial understanding. Okay, so let's see an example of this. So this is an example from algebra item 5. So in the typical version, it says, this is the student page. So we're pretending that the student is sitting across. It's set up this way just so you can see it more easily. So I highlighted the important parts of this. And I would, this is, if I was giving this assessment, that's what I would do. I would highlight those the parts of it to jumped out at me. It says, show the student assessment page. That's what this is. Read and point to pattern. All right, I will. Blue, yellow, blue, yellow. Then I give my yellow and blue foam tiles so the student will match the pattern. Okay. So, well, that makes sense because that's what the item is. Student will match and duplicate an AB pattern. So there's two things the student has to do to meet the criteria for this. So I'm giving these to my student and I'll say match the pattern, and the student, then I'm covering up the cookies there. Then the student can move those, pick them up and move them because my student has the motor skills to do that if I'm giving that typical version. So that's half of it, right? So the student did match blue, yellow, blue, yellow, one on top of the other is great, but we still have the other half to go. So the student needs to duplicate that AB pattern. And so I'm laying some cookie shapes on the table and I'll say duplicate the pattern with circle and square cookies. Now put those on the table, right there they are. And then the student will then take those and placing them below will duplicate the pattern. Now, if the student is starting to place them on top of here to duplicate it, I don't see anything wrong with that. But if they're not placing it, to show that they're duplicating the pattern, I would just redirect them, start here. That's all you would need to do. So let's say the student did that, duplicated the pattern with circle and square cookies. And that's a duplicated pattern, all right. So the student got both. And that's what that student needed to get a 1. If the student did not duplicate the pattern correctly, that student would have gotten a 0 because it's 1 or 0 for the typical item. Now, we also had star cookies out, and often we get this question, so I'm going to mention that. The star cookies are there, and if the student uses them, what happens? So, well, if I say, duplicate the pattern with star, square, or circle, cookie, square, cookie, circle, cookie, that's what I would expect to see. But what if the student didn't really listen all that closely and put down circle, star, circle, star? Well, I want to know if my student can duplicate the pattern. And if they bypass what I said about the square and just put in the circle, star, I'd say, well, she duplicated the pattern. And then I'd make a note about not listening to the directions fully. And that might be a goal. If I keep seeing that kind of thing happen, that may be an objective or a goal for that particular student. So if the student got both, and the student got both, my looking at my criteria here matches that, I'd put in a 1. That's all I need to do for that item. I'd move it on to the next one. Now let's take a look at what would it look like if I was giving the accommodation version. So let's say my student had, and a student with an accommodation version might not always have a communication device, but I'd say most of the time probably that's the case. Let's say my student had colors and shapes on their communication device. I can use those, or more I should say, my student can use those to tell me what to do. So it says to show the student assessment page. I show this to my student and I'll read and point to the pattern. Here's pattern, right? Blue, yellow, and I'm going to put the tiles on the table, right? And I'm going to say match the pattern. So I'm pointing to the square. I want my student to match the pattern, and my student then can tell me blue or yellow. Let's say my student said blue, I will move the blue. Student says, I point to the next one. Student says yellow, I move the yellow, and so on. So the student is directing me by using a communication device, right? So we'll do the same thing with duplicating the pattern, right? But this time these are cookie shapes. So that's kind of nice. I can use circle and square, and I'll make sure that my student can see that's a circle, that's a square, that's a star. Be very clear about that. And I'll say duplicate the pattern with circle and square cookies. So I have the cookies placed here. My student tells me, I say, this is where the first one goes. Student tells me, okay, it's the circle. Then it's the square, right? And I want to make sure that the student knows, and a lot of times students who need accommodations need to know where the action's going on, right? So if I need to guide my student, put the first, duplicate the pattern here, keep going here, and just they can acclimate to what's going on and where they find their what they need to pay attention to in that the correct space. I would do that for them. I would make sure that they had that. The student can still duplicate the pattern in that situation, and I know that they're duplicating the pattern, right? Even though I'm guiding them to start here and move from one space to the next. So my student then, and I said the word duplicate here, and I'm saying that for a reason you'll hear in a minute, duplicating the pattern, matching the pattern. My student did both of those. That's full understanding, right? Student did it. I'm marking one, just like my student using the typical item. So both those students got that correct. Now I'm looking at the adaptation item, and the criteria shifts here because I'm no longer measuring the full understanding of the objective. And I'm going to use a method that can be actually used for anybody, including that accommodation version. So I can record on the step-by-step communicator or anything else you might have. You might even have a different response that the student uses when they're choosing. Like it might be yay, or that's it, or yes, or anything will work, right? As long as you know that they know what that means. In this case, I'm pretending my student doesn't have a way to communicate with me. So I'm going to record that's the one I want, and I'll do the pointing so the student can tell me which one, and then I'll place it. Also, what changes here is that it doesn't say duplicate, it says make the pattern with cookies. So we get to duplicate, that's slightly different. That's not full understanding, right? It's partial understanding. And also the criteria, the student only needs to match up one of two units. This has a unit of blue and yellow and a second unit of blue and yellow. So the student only needs to do one of those to get partial credit. All right, so I read the pattern again, blue, yellow, and then I will point to the first pile, right? And I will say match this pattern. I print a blue, yellow, right? Point there, then I point to blue, then I point to yellow, and my student chooses, and I move the blue. And then we repeat, right? That same thing, and I'm just going to skip over that whole process. And this is what my student did. So my student matched one of two units. That's part of the criteria, right? One of two units. So far we're doing okay. We're going to repeat that same thing now using the cookies, right? Well, before we do that, I need to reset that incorrect pattern, right? So the student didn't get the whole thing, but I want to make sure the student's set up for success for the next item. So I'm resetting that incorrectly matched pattern. So now that's ready to go. I have cookies now. As you can see, I put cookies down. And again, I'm pointing to say match this pattern and asking the student to tell me when I point to the right one, right? Student told me cookie when I pointed to cookie. When I pointed to square, the student said that's the one I want. When I pointed to cookie, the circle cookie, student said that's the one. And we just repeated, and the student got all of them, right? So now the criteria was that the student would get one of two in both. Well, the student got one of two in the first one and got two of two in the second one. My student has partial credit for that, knows that partially, and I clicked or checked it. Sorry, I checked the check mark in the box with the A above it. Okay, that's the adaptation version. So there's support all the way through. And of course, I'm not giving away the answer, right? I'm carefully waiting for my student to tell me what to do because I truly want to know what my student is doing. So I'm going to be careful about not giving away the answer in all of that. So I talked a little bit about the communication device and having certain things on a device if a student can handle that. That's what the speech and language clinician thinks. So sometimes there's pick symbol choices, and I would put those in a display and my student can choose from that. And we can do that with the step-by-step as well. Then there's other responses. If I'm showing a display, eye gaze, point, touch, and then, or you point and the student responds with a smile, a nod, or the step-by-step as I showed you a moment ago. Those things not only work for the assessment, but those things work in the classroom too. So if you encourage teachers, if you have students, and I'm thinking many of you have students who do not have a lot of message locations on their device, they might be, I'm a brand new communicator, I've got one switch that says hi, but how are we going to talk in math class? Use the things you're using in math class for answer choices, for students to have choices to make comments, right? To be able to answer a question from an assessment. Use what the students are using. During the lesson, that helps students connect them. It helps connect them to the other students because it's a shared experience. Having that and using materials from the lesson, it's in context. And when you're in context and you're saying something, you're making a choice to say something, other students pay attention and respond to you more because they understand what you're talking about. So it not only works here in the assessment, but in the lesson as well. So let's, oh, one more thing, I would skip past this. There are often you'll see items pictured at the bottom. Those are answer choices that you can use that too. You can point to those. You can also quickly put objects on top of those answer choices if that's what you need to do for your student who's a concrete learner. Okay, so in the attending and exploring screening tool, it is very quick, actually, screening tool. It has one page with a tiny protocol at the bottom that's 9 items. And then there is just one response page there. So essentially what you're doing is you don't have to use this for every student. It's only the student where you're thinking, can I just place my student in chapter 1 or should I give more subtests? And you're just kind of wondering. This will help you make that decision. That's all this is, so that you know that. And it is in members only. Again, it's in that equals assessment folder, and it says attending and exploring screening tool. What happens is if the student gets 6 or less correct out of those 9, student can begin in chapter 1. If the student has more than 6, give the student the other subtests as well, because they might have more math knowledge than you know. This could happen quite easily with a student you haven't had before, that's for sure. If you want to begin your students in the assessment, even though you think they'll probably end up in chapter 1, that's up to you. Some teachers like to have those scores to compare what the student is learning year to year. Then you give the assessment year to year. The directions are right here. And I have an example. So this is the very first example. The very first lesson of equals, the student will attend a math instruction. So that's what we're measuring here. There's a typical and an accommodation and an adaptation view here. Or I should say assessment types. So it's just like the assessment in that way, that you have the same types. So in the typical way, the directions say that I need to place 2 manipulatives on the table. It's at random. You want to pick manipulatives that you know your student will be interested in, use those. That's fine. So I'll put those there, and then I will set the timer for a minute. And every 5 seconds, I'm going to look at my student and see if my student is attending. Okay. And every time my student is attending, I'm going to just make a tally mark. Then I'm going to repeat that process during a math lesson. So it could just be an exploration math lesson, or it could be another class, maybe science, right? Just to see if the student has the ability to attend and is interested in what happens at school. So that's the typical version. The accommodation version is going to be the same thing, but it's every 3 minutes. Or I'm sorry, the length of time is 3 minutes, and you're watching the student again every 5 seconds. I'm giving my student more time. And then for the adaptation version, they get 5 minutes, and I'm going to look at my student every 5 seconds to see if they're attending. So any attending will do. The student is smiling at something or trying to reach it, or was able to grab it or knocks it on the floor. All of that is attending, so that can all count. The reason why we increase the time, of course, is because the more you support the student needs, the more time they're going to need typically to respond. So we wanted to increase that time and give them that benefit. So that's pretty much the kind of thing that you will see in attending exploring screening tool. You can quickly run through it and see what it's like. But it is the pages that you'll find here, as I said earlier, are with the other subtests in book 1. So you'll see attending and exploring at the bottom, the very first tab on the left. So that's where those pages are. This scoring portion of the attending and exploring screening tool, that's whole screening tool, is found in members only in the assessment folder. If you find out that, like, say you give the attending and exploring screening tool and you find out your student, oh my gosh, got more than 6 on that, I'm going to jump to algebra. You can take the last 4 items of the attending and exploring screening tool, enter them into the first 4 items of algebra. You put the scores right in because they're identical. So let's take a look at some additional support. So we want students to have all due opportunity to show their math knowledge, right? And built-in support might not be enough. In that case, that's what the Action Dictionary is for, not only in the assessment, but in the lessons as well. So, of course, we want students to have all that opportunity to show us. It's often so hidden for us to know what they understand. The Action Dictionary will support language, motor, vision, attention, cognition, any of those things. And you see a lot of opportunities, a lot of things to choose from. Just for the word count, you see 3 pages of ideas of how to support the student in not to learn how to count, because that's what the lessons are for, but rather to give students the support they need to use the tools so they can count, right? It gives them that opportunity to do that. So you can see there's a tremendous amount of options there. This is an example of counting with objects. Now, the assessment is built so that the student will make choices based on what they know about counting, for example, or counting, let's say, 3 butterflies. So it would be the student typically watching me and stopping me when I get to 3, if I'm counting 3 butterflies. You might want more information. You might think, I don't know. That might have been just a guess. I'm not sure. What if I can have my student move the objects and count them with the step-by-step? Or I don't hear the student counting. The student places 3 butterflies, moves 3 butterflies and stop. Okay, all right, I just saw my student count 3 butterflies. You can record on that step-by-step communicator. You can record all of the numbers from 1 to 100. So you've got 2 minutes. So you can give that to your student, record one after the other. So every time the student presses the button, the next number is spoken out loud, right? So either way, if you want to use that or they have their own device to do that, you certainly can do that. So I could show my student if they haven't used this before, I'll say, I make a set of 2 butterflies. And I do that and I sweep them and I counted 2 butterflies. All right. So now I will have the student try, and I can even put these on the tray one at a time. And I can say, make a set of 3 butterflies, and the student can move it. And I will not encourage my student anyway. I might repeat, make a set of 3 if the student just stops altogether, but I don't want to coach my student through this. I want to know, does my student know what it means to count 3 butterflies? I could do the same with objects attached to the math line. I could do this with anchoring the tray and the box with an open end this way, and my student can sweep the butterfly in and say 1 with a step-by-step, and then I place the next one and so on. Now, there are ways to support students choosing, right? We have a pocket chart included, so you can put objects and pictures in. There's a variety of ways to do that. So if you're wondering, how can I have a display that will work for my student, you've got ideas there. Now, what's interesting about this is that sometimes when you look at the assessment, we have tried to make every part of this assessment accessible without having you gather a lot of materials as well. And that's sometimes a real fine line to walk on. And this is an example of that fine line. What I have provided here in this assessment is an ice cream image, an image of a hot chocolate, and a cube image. And I want my student to do this, show a picture of something that is hot. That's my direction to my student. Now, in the adaptation versions, I have a way for my student to make a choice. I know my student can choose in that way. It's set up. So even if the student has nonverbal abilities and doesn't have a communication device, I can set it up so my student can make a choice. But that's not my problem here. My problem here is These are semi-concrete choices. Does my student know what that means? I don't have an ice cream cone, hot chocolate, and a cube for my student. We thought, how in the world are we going to do this? Let's let the teachers go to the Action Dictionary for this, and they can then find an idea. And one of those ideas I just mentioned, different ways that you could, and I showed the pictures from the Action Dictionary, different ways you could provide choices, and I mentioned objects, and that's what we can do here. These are semi-concrete choices. These might not even be familiar choices. But if I think about this, and I want to make this more concrete, what can I do? What do we usually have around us all the time? We carry water bottles. I can fill a water bottle up with cold water right away, and that's one of the choices for cold, right, instead of ice cream. I can get a washcloth and I can squeeze it out under some warm water. That's my warm choice. And then I can have a cube there and I can ask the same question and have my student touch each one and tell me. Now that's more measuring hot and cold. Does my student understand that? Now I'm giving my student all due opportunity. I can do the same with the picture of the elephant and the feather, heavy, light, in a circle. So show a picture of something is heavy. Well, that, there are a lot of students that would get that an elephant is heavy, but I had students that would not have gotten that. So back to the Action Dictionary again, objects, right? What are my object choices? Something that's heavy but feels heavy is a can of food. That's easy. All right, I got that at home. I'll bring that in. Something that's light, a spoon, right? Which one's heavy, which one's light, and have that as, and have a circle there to ask my student. Show me something, try each one. Now show me something that's heavy. Show me something that's light. And if they don't understand heavy and light, they're going to get it wrong. Well, then they get it wrong. And then that's something they need to then take into account when they're being placed, right? That was wrong. So that just shows that the Action Dictionary will fill in those gaps when things like that happen. And you can get ideas on how to really truly know what your student knows. So, the assessment is already differentiated. We've got the screening tool. We've got choices, different ways to make choices. Concrete representations and tools are there. 3 test item versions, that's a lot. But you might have to make those thoughtful decisions, just like I did a moment ago. Read through the version, use the tools. And if you don't think it's going to work out, look at that Action Dictionary and see, how can that help your student let you know what they know without giving away the answer, right? And I would make a note of it so that next time you give that assessment, you don't have to think about it. It's right there. You already have it recorded on the protocol. So let's take a look at scoring. We're going to look at assessment scoring, hand scoring first, and then we're moving on to electronic scoring and creating groups. So in assessment scoring, the student is going, or I'm sorry, you'll be assessing all 5 of the subtests because attending and exploring is separate. That's already happened by the time we get here. The correct answer is 1. The incorrect answer is 0. The adaptation item, you mark a 1 or a 0. So that's checking in that A column or typing X in the adaptation column in the electronic scoring. The basal and ceiling are each 3 consecutive items. If you're not familiar with that, we're going to get into that in a minute. Manual scoring, there is a scoring table that is in the protocol itself. So when you look there, you'll see that. That will help you. And then the suggested start point chart and samples are in that assessment manual introduction. So manual scoring, you don't have to worry about this if you're electronic scoring, but if you're manually scoring, the scoring table is right within that student response booklet. You'll see it there. It looks like a worksheet, like a section of big empty spaces in it. And in the assessment manual, you see a start point chart, and it's listed that way. The electronic scoring student response booklet, the protocol is only if you have to transfer the scores to the electronic scoring. You don't have a computer in your area. If you have a computer in your area, you can put the scores in as you go. And then the electronic scoring will take over from there. Once you put in those the name and the initial scores, the rest of it is populated. So it's pretty exciting to see. We've already talked about this 1 for correct, 0 for incorrect, and click under the A column to indicate that you gave the adaptation item, okay? And then again, in electronic scoring, the adaptation is the only one that actually makes a difference in the scoring. When you mark accommodation, you're only getting the information, just to remember what you did with your student. So when you establish a basal, essentially it's a time saver, and that's true for a ceiling too. I consider the ceiling much more important than the basal because the ceiling prevents a student from going on to much harder items. Wouldn't really want to put my students through that. But the basal you can use is kind of nice. It's 3 consecutive items correct. So you can guess. You can always start with 1 if you want. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if I want to save some time here, so I'm going to say, all right, I think my student could get 6, 7, 8. And let's say I gave 6, 7, and 8. My student did it. I can count everything prior to that correct. I only gave 3 items, but I ended up scoring 8 items because I can assume that. And that's built into the test, so that's okay. I could try it and be wrong. I could say, oh, I think my student will get 8, 9, 10, and oops, they got 10 wrong. I can go back 1 into 7, see if my student got that. If it's 3 in a row, I can stop. Now, that doesn't mean stop the whole test. That means stop that subtest. You still need all the other subtests information, right? And you can at any time just start at 1 again and fill in those spaces if you want, right? Okay, the ceiling's a little different. The ceiling, I feel like you really have to follow the ceiling just to kind of prevent the student from having to do things that they're unsure about. But it is a time saver for you too. The ceiling is 3 consecutive incorrect items. So here I can see I've got 2 zeros and then I got a 1. Well, that's not going to work. I got to keep testing. So I did. I went on to 15, 16, 17. Now I have 3 in a row. I stopped testing the subtest. Again, I never stopped the whole test based on one subtest. All of the subtests are completed. Okay. But it is a time saver too, but it does save the student from having to do really hard things that are just, and that's not fun to do that. You want to make it a positive experience for sure. So use the scoring table. This is, I'll show you in a second what this looks like, but it's a scoring table on page 3 of the response booklet. There's directions there. We already talked about incorrect and correct answers, but in the adaptation items, those are going to be adjusted and counted as half. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. So here is the manual scoring table, again with the protocol. Here I have my subtest listed and the total. I have place for raw scores, place for adaptations, and then there's a little math to do. So let's say, right, we've got raw score, adaptations, there's my math, there's the final score at the end and the placement. So I filled in the raw scores. That means the total amount correct that the student got. I added them up. My student got 136 items correct. For adaptations, I'm looking at that. Remember, we're hand scoring it. So I'm looking at that paper protocol. And I see that my student got this one, and this one. These 3 are all associated with correct items. I'm counting those. This one, however, I use the adapted version and my student got a 0. I'm not counting that adaptation item at all. I'm only counting the ones where I have something to take half off. I can't take half off of the 0. So I'm taking a half off of the ones that my student got right. So the student showed me that he knew what something right about that particular assessment item. The student knew something. That's good. Partial knowledge. Okay, so here are my items. Here are these already, I counted these up. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. I've got 3 items that are adapted items, not counting the red one, right? So here, this is the subtest. I've got 3 items, or 3, sorry, adaptations here. I got 6 items correct in the measurement subtest. That's where we were. So now, there's my 3, right? So now I'm going to add up my adaptations now that I have them all there. And I put in 46 here. That is the number of adaptations right here. So you can see as I point my arrow, I've got 46 here. I moved my 136 to here because this is going on the bottom is going to be my equation. I multiply 46 times 0.5 because I'm cutting that in half, and that gives me 23. I subtract 136 minus 23, right? 136 total raw score minus 23 adaptations. I end up with 113. I go to the manual, which will show me the suggested start point chart in the introduction, and I see that 113 falls between 102 point, 1, I think it is, to 122, 113 falls within there. That means my student is placed in chapter 6. Where in 6 is going to be up to you. And so we're going to talk about how that works. This is an example of the scoring table found on the 3rd page of the protocol booklet. Calculate the raw score by totaling the correct items from each subtest in the raw score column and the number of correct adaptation items in the adaptation column. The bottom rows and columns are for calculating the adjusted raw score. Once an adjusted raw score has been calculated, write it on the line to easily reference when identifying the chapter placement found in the introduction pages of the assessment manual. Let's look at an example of a completed scoring table. You can find more examples in the introduction pages of either assessment manual. In this example, the student answered 136 items correctly, total. The amount correct for each subtest is recorded and totaled in the bottom row. Here are the scores for the measurement subtest. The next step is to go back and look over how many of those correct items were given using the adaptation version. Go back through each subtest and count the total number of check marks in the A or adaptation item column. It is important to only count the adaptation items that were answered correctly. The red check mark that you see shows that the adaptation version was given in item 6, but the student answered incorrectly. The student scored 0 on that item, and you don't want to penalize the student an additional half point, so don't count that adaptation. So for this subtest, there are a total of 3 adaptations, the ones that you see the check marks in black. Record 3 on the score table for the measurement subtest. The amount of correct items assessed with the adaptation version are recorded in the adaptation column and totaled. The total amount of adaptations is 46. The raw score is a total of 136 items, and there are 46 adaptation items that were correct. Record the total raw score in the total raw score column. Calculate adaptation score by multiplying the total of 46 by 0.5. 46 times 0.5, or half, equals 23. Record 23 in the total adaptations column. Subtract the adaptation score from the total raw score to calculate the adjusted raw score. In this example, 136 minus 23 equals 113. Record that amount on the line adjusted raw score. Use the adjusted raw score on this suggested start point chart. This chart is found within the introduction in either assessment manual. The score of 113 falls into the Chapter 6 range. The range for Chapter 6 is a score between 102.1 and 122. So 113 fits right within that range. Write Chapter 6 as the chapter placement. At this point, you would expect your student to begin in Chapter 6. However, the exact starting point in Chapter 6 will be determined by taking a closer look at the test items and the scores, of your student and other students to find a reasonable common placement to form groups. Let's take a look next at electronic scoring. What you're seeing on the screen right now is an Excel spreadsheet that was used to create electronic scoring for Equals Math. I've clicked on the first tab that you can see at the bottom of the screen. The tab says Info Instructions. So know on that first tab, you'll see all the instructions that you need to know. If you look next to that first tab at the bottom, I just clicked on Student 1, Student 2, Student 3, Student 4, Student 5, and then I have to click the dots there to get to Student 6. That tells you that there are 6 tabs, enough space in this particular document to enter the scores of 6 students. You can use this electronic protocol during the assessment and use what you see in front of you as the protocol, it's an electronic protocol, as long as you have access to a computer, a laptop, where you are completing the assessment. If you don't have access to technology to use this tool, then use the paper protocol and enter the scores. And I'll show you how that little bit of work, moving the scores from the paper protocol to the electronic scoring, will be of great benefit and certainly worthwhile. So let's just take a look at an empty protocol, and then we'll look at an example of a protocol that's both are electronic. On the left, you see the column subtest. So when I scroll down, I can see the purple algebra subtest that comes first and the item number next to it. So as I move down, I see that, of course, the numbers go up, and you can see right away that there are 16 algebra items in the algebra subtest. Data is next, right? I can scroll down. I can see that there are 18 items in data. After that is geometry. Keep scrolling, measurement, and then numbers and operations, which is the longest one. And we know from training that more than likely you will not be giving your students every single one of these items. You also know that regardless of the order that you see here in electronic scoring, you can enter your scores in any order you wish. The only thing that you cannot do with electronic scoring, you cannot add more columns, you cannot add more rows. That will break the formula that is in this electronic scoring tool. I would suggest that you always have a brand new copy of the electronic scoring tool with your members only materials. Then if something would happen by accident, you have broken the formula, you can always go back and get another one and do a save as, and then you have that again. So if I look at the very first tab where I'm at right here, right? I'm at student 1. I don't want that to remain student 1. I want it to have another name so that I can associate any scores that I enter with that student's name. So I just simply right click rename, and then I'll put Karen in, that's my name. So let's say that I'm the student, I'm in tab 1. Okay, you do that first because any scores that you add now to this protocol will remain attached to this person. So if you have to write Karen R or Karen Z or whatever your student's name is to distinguish from the other students, you can certainly do that. It's just a simple save as. What else is nice about this protocol is that you can see not only the subtest and the assessment item number, but next to that refers you to a lesson and a lesson objective, a lesson number, right, and a lesson objective. That's the benchmark we pulled from the lessons to create this lesson, or excuse me, to create this assessment item. So you see that direct link, and you can see that how we pulled these right across the chapters. Now that's going to come in handy later, but just so you know that's there. If there is an adaptation, if you've used an adaptation for your student, mark an X in this box. So this replaces checking the box for an adaptation on the paper protocol, which you'll be using what you see here in this column, just simply an X. You can just leave it blank if you did not use an adaptation item. Next to that, you see accommodation. If you use the accommodation test item, you'll want to just mark that just so you have that information. We know that the X or the check mark and the adaptation of that particular test item will affect the score. So any adaptations that I use and I mark an X is going to subtract a half off, right? We know that. In the paper protocol, I showed you how you do that manually. Here, you just put the X in the column of the matching the item number that you gave, or the item number that you gave to your student in the assessment, and the score will come out automatically applying that formula. So that's nice, right? You don't have to do any math there. It goes very fast. The accommodation mark of an X is not going to affect a score. That's information only, just for you. And it does tell you that here. So in case you don't remember which one's which, it will tell you right here. Next is a score of 1 or 0. So it's essentially just typing and clicking and typing a 1, right? Just as I am doing now. A 0. Once I reach the ceiling, I can stop putting in zeros. It will count everything after the ceiling as a 0. So I won't have to do that. On the side, you see a place for comment. So you can put in additional adaptations that you provided for your student. Great information for you if you assess your student using the equals assessment again. Great for reporting on the results so that you can say to parents, you're sharing how that student did. In the assessment, you say, well, I took a note. This is what I provided for your son or daughter to complete this item correctly. Also nice when you get into the lessons. What did I use as an adaptation for my student? We were working with the number line, and what did I use to support the student? That might be something that you put in your comment. So something you can refer back to. Okay, so you get the general idea of this. I'm going to now come out of my blank example and show one that's already been filled with students' names. So this is one where these are not real students. I put some scores in so that we could talk about an example of how this works. So we talked about this, right? I have Lisa, Henry, Denisha, Freddie, Libby, Sam. All right, so each of their protocols is right here. Now, this information that you enter is going to be automatically scored. So you can see all of the scores that I put in here. You might be able to see some X's. There's some accommodation X's. There's some adaptation X's in there as well. All of those scores are now going to automatically be calculated and waiting for you in the next tabs. So the next tab after the students' names would be chapters 1 through 10, meaning that the entire lesson order from 1A1 to the end of chapter 10 is listed here in order. Anything that you see with a color is a part of the assessment. Those are the benchmarks, right? Those are the assessment items. For the assessment, they're also the benchmarks we pulled from the lessons. Anything that is a lesson that's in white, that's not part of the assessment, but it does give you a feel of what's going to be happening in a particular chapter. So if I'm looking at my students' scores and I see how my student did in algebra, and I see it's from the early part of the lessons in equals, it's the first 4 items in the algebra subtest. When I look at that, I can say, okay, well, what came before that? All right, I don't have any information about that, about those items, but if I go further on, do I find something that links to this algebra item within that same chapter? I can gain some information about it. How did my student do? If I look over at the scores compared to everyone else, it looks like everybody did pretty well here. So I'm starting to get a feel for where everybody's at. So I not only get that context of the assessment items within the chapters to kind of feel my way through that and see where the students' strengths and challenges are in a chapter point of view. I also get that comparison to others who are potential group members. So that's the beauty of having the chapters 1 through 10 context for all of those benchmarks that are, of course, the assessment items. The next tab shows you an order, but this time it's in the order of each subtest. So I can look at algebra and I can see, first of all, an overall glimpse of where my students are at the beginning of algebra, right, and data, and so on, right? I can get a feel for where everybody's at in each of those subtest areas. So that's another way to compare. Where are the strengths? Where are the challenges? What have students been taught before? What have they not been taught? And then finally, the last tab, and I scrolled down here earlier so you could see this, but we'll scroll up in a second. This is where you'll see your chapter placement. So based on the scores, automatically this filled in for Lisa, Henry, and Denisha, they'll be in chapter 1. For Freddie, Libby, and Sam, they'll be in chapter 3. Now, if I go all the way to the top here, I can see this is divided into subtests again, and what it offers you is another view of how students are doing. So we looked at the individual subtests and saw in a general kind of a view how students compared with each other, where they were at, where were their strengths, and so on. But here I get a percentage, which can be used in present levels of performance. I wouldn't use that percentage to compare students. It doesn't work that way, to compare student scores and who's going to be working in a group with other students. It's not helpful for that, but it is a way to measure individuals from year to year. So if you give the assessment from year to year, you do have this percentage from each of these subtests as another way to compare how students are doing. Oh, my student improved in algebra, had more correct, had a higher percentage than last time. I can take a look and just see if there's improvements in any particular subtest, and that's good to see. It's another bit of information. So let's go back and see how this works with an example. Let's continue with placement and grouping. The purpose of using the equals assessment is to find the best placement for a student's understanding and success. It has been reported as being a very accurate tool in determining where students should begin in equals. It is also very useful for creating small groups and informing instruction. When I look at the student's areas of success and challenges, I may detect what a student has retained from past math instruction, as well as identify content areas that have or have not been provided. Detecting missing prerequisite skills that may impact future learning is another benefit that will inform my instruction. The structure of equals lesson order with assessment item scores can be very useful in writing IEP goals. Also, when students are placed in the appropriate chapter, section, and lesson, they're more prepared to begin, as it is not too difficult for them, yet challenging enough so students can begin to gain confidence as they learn. You now have the resources to group students with a similar placement to benefit from group learning and fill gaps in learning and vocabulary to meet the needs of individual students. Let's continue forward with placement of students within the curriculum and forming groups. Students benefit greatly when they are grouped with peers. They learn more with their peers, which also provides a sense of belonging. Students learn more when they talk about math, as has been proven by research. Students learn to work together when they have multiple opportunities to do so. The presence of manipulatives, visuals, and supports provides a more accessible way to learn with and from peers and an opportunity to interact with them during and after a shared experience. Opportunities to discuss, share, play games, and solve problems occur across the entire lesson. Students see more examples and models. They can watch their peers, see what their peers are doing at the table, directly linked to what they've been doing. Talking about shared experience has a very positive impact on communication. We are hearing many reports that students' language and use of their communication devices has increased as they are observed talking about math vocabulary and actions from math class in other settings at school and at home. When placing and grouping students, remember the opportunities to learn from others has benefits. If a student is placed in a group and is already familiar with the concepts in the lesson, use the opportunity to review concepts and vocabulary in a curriculum that is new to the students as they get used to it. Use the opportunity for students to learn problem-solving process with familiar concepts as that reduces the cognitive load. Use the opportunity for students to learn and review related vocabulary and or gain deeper understanding of the concept. Be sure to write specific details and observations in the comment column for each student to help identify individual students' vocabulary, strengths, challenges, and adaptations or accommodations that work. Assessment items are benchmarks from the equals lessons. Not all lesson objectives are represented in the assessment. When viewing strengths and challenges in the assessment items, look at the surrounding lessons that are not measured in the equals assessment to further determine what your student knows, does not know, or the amount of knowledge your students have. And finally, it is important to remember from the chosen starting point, teach all lessons from that point forward, regardless of students' past assessment scores. It is also important to remember, do not place students in chapters higher than scoring recommends. This puts the student at the disadvantage of missing vocabulary and action words and prerequisite concepts that are necessary for learning and building that learning over time. There is a fail-safe when placing students. After placement, you can teach or review a prior lesson. If a student has missed vocabulary or a concept from the past, go back to teach or review a lesson, portion of a lesson, or just vocabulary and action words, but place your students so you can keep this at a minimum. It is ideal for the student to keep moving forward, gradually building skills in an organized way. However, if the absence of a concept or lack of practice greatly affects a student or students in their learning with a new lesson, you may have no other choice but to go back. Spending time with students reviewing parts of a previous lesson is very appropriate work for a paraprofessional for a lesson that has already been taught to that student in the past. And a placement can be changed if needed. If the student has been placed in equals and is struggling to keep up or to understand, you can reevaluate their placement. Each electronic scoring spreadsheet has a place for 6 students' data. If you have more students, think about which students would be more likely to be grouped together. Keep one pristine copy of the electronic scoring document in members-only materials, so you can always make another one if links are broken. And save as working copies 1 or working copy 2 and so on to accommodate up to 6 students per copy. Earlier, we saw the subtest scores and chapter placement at the bottom of the final tab subtest scores chapter. For our example today, Freddie, Libby, and Sam are all placed in chapter 3. We have a group of students we are hoping that can be placed together in a common section of chapter 3. And we will begin with chapters 1 through 10 tab that contains assessment items within the equals lessons in lesson order. It is meant for comparing scores, for creating groups, and choosing a section and lesson to begin, hopefully common within that group. This tab provides 2 types of information. Each assessment item is an identified benchmark taken from the list of lessons. Assessment items are shown in the context of the total lesson order in color codes connected to the subtest. Lesson objectives shown in white are equals lessons not included in the assessment. It is a good reminder to note that there are many equals lessons not represented in the assessment where you may find other students' strengths or challenges. The other piece of information found on this tab is vocabulary, identified in the assessment items that matches vocabulary used in the lesson. We will put that aside for a moment while we take a look at comparisons of scores in our group of 3 students, Freddie, Libby, and Sam, for the purpose of determining possible group members. Freddie, Libby, and Sam have been placed in Chapter 3. So now I want to decide where in Chapter 3 they can begin together, starting with the same lesson. I can choose to start at the beginning of a section or with any lesson within a section. We will begin with the assessment items in chapters 1 through 10 tab. You can see the color-coded assessment items are placed and loaded with each student's scores within the context of equals lesson order to compare and create a group at the same starting point in a section within their identified chapter placement, which in this case is chapter 3. In this view, you can get an idea of how students would work together within the same group of lessons. Not all students' knowledge will fit perfectly within the same order as everyone else, so some compromises may need to be made. However, strengths of group members can support other students. This view of ordered lessons also informs instruction and review to cover gaps in the sequence of skills. Freddie, Libby, and Sam are all placed in Chapter 3. Our task is to place the students in a section of Chapter 3, hopefully together, as small group instruction is a very valuable part of teaching equals. Here we see the first section of Chapter 3, 3A. We can see assessment item 19 from the numbers and operations subtest in blue, and item 5 from the data subtest in light orange. The scores look similar, with both Freddie and Sam missing the item in numbers and operations, joining and separating amounts of 2, 3, 4, and 5, and describing parts and whole. Libby was able to complete this item correctly. Moving down to the data item, all 3 students were able to place data in a simple bar graph. The information in this section is limited due to the small amount of only 2 benchmarks included from the assessment. This is section 3B, chapter 3, section B, shows a challenge for all 3 students in numbers and operations items 20 and 21 in blue. These, as in section A, focus on parts and whole. 2 of 3 students were able to extend and record an AB pattern in the purple algebra item at the bottom. In section C, all 5 assessment items are from numbers and operations, and all 3 students were unable to show understanding for any of these. This shows a challenge for all 3 students with a lack of knowledge of number sense up to 10 that goes beyond basic counting and number identification. We saw this in related prerequisite skills already in sections A and B. In section D, the 3 assessment items are all from the measurement subtest. 3 students have a basic knowledge of measurement tools and can identify dollar amounts of $1, $5, and $10. However, 2 of 3 students do not know how to weigh and identify the weight of objects. In section E, Freddie and Libby have challenges with identifying parts of a shape, such as lines, sides, line segments, vertices, and angles, whereas this seems to be a strength area for Sam. In section F, which is the last section of this particular chapter 3, all students missed 4 of 4 numbers and operations items with no or limited knowledge of basic number sense past 10 beyond basic counting. Freddie and Libby can tell time to the hours. You can see in the last item, which is in orange from measurement. So Freddie and Libby can tell time to the hour, but Sam cannot. So in looking at what the students have in common, where their strengths and challenges lie, I'm seeing a common thread of what's happening in numbers and operations throughout chapter 3. So let's take a closer look at that. I wrote out the kinds of things I observed as I looked at and compared scores within chapter 3 for my students of Freddie, Libby, and Sam. We know that the students had strengths in chapters 1 and 2. So when you look back to chapters 1 and 2, you'll see that chapter 1 is that beginning chapter that starts with attending and exploring and all of the beginning elements of the content areas. So pre-readiness, essentially. By the time you get to chapter 2, students are mostly learning about numerals to 10 and counting. So the students we know have done well in those chapters, or else they would not have been placed in chapter 3. So it's important to know. So everybody has strengths there. When we look at other strengths, we can see that 3D is a strength for all of the students, that particular section. We see that Libby also had some strengths in 3A and Sam had some strengths in 3E. So they have that in common, that 3D is a strong chapter. Looking at challenges, Freddie and Sam had some challenges in 3A, but also challenges in 3B, 3C, and 3F go across the board for all 3 students. So I'm seeing that they have, actually the students do have a lot in common. Whereas Libby does have a strength in 3A, the other students don't, but we only were looking at 2 benchmarks there. So we have to always be on the side of caution and think, well, maybe I want to take a closer look at what Freddie and Sam can do on that particular page, and Libby as well. But we do know that in 3A, that section, it's the first time we saw the numbers and operations a benchmark, and the students didn't do well at that overall.